Hello and welcome to Technique Friday. Today's lesson is going to be about Inktense block and Inktense pencils. So I have a set of 72 blocks. Actually, I have two sets. And I also have a tin of 36, but I have some free ones as well, so I've got about, I don't know, 45, almost 50. Right, so now all I want to do is talk to you about the properties of Inktense before we even get started. So the properties of Inktense, they are an ink and they are not a watercolor pencil. The ink in them is made to dry permanent. But one thing that I've noticed is if you apply a thick coat of these and you do not fully activate all the layers of the blocks that you've used, that the bottom layers may activate out. So I did a page recently where I did quite a lot of layers of Inktense blocks and blended them with water and had it all marbled and looking yummy. And then I was surprised that they moved a little bit later on, and I realised that I hadn't wet right down to the paper when I was water activating them. So you need to make sure that they are quite water activated. I have two sets. I have a dry set and a wet set. This is my wet set. My wet set I use out of the pan together. And I actually have made something that fits underneath and gives me something that's easy to pull these out and also supports that top tin. Now this makes it easier for me to use these blocks all together having it done like that, because these pans that you've got break quite easily. The plastic on the edges here is very flimsy, and what I've done is filled that whole lot with cardboard underneath and taped it in. And then just given myself handles so it's easier for me to lift them out, and they stay there. And I use aqua brushes or paint brushes dipped in water to activate this particular set. The other set I just use for dry, but I'm just going to use this one set today for dry and wet because it's just easier to do. So the thing that I love about Inktense, which is why I was so eager to get this product in the first place, was that it dries permanent, and that is a really reasonably rare property. When you're looking at water activated and water soluble media, to have something dry permanent is rare. So that's why these things are making such a big splash on the market, because they dry permanent. And that is a big thing. Particularly as a watercolor artist, I actually like to lay down Inktense blocks as my underlayers. They won't move and you can layer straight on top of them, and I love that. And I love the fact that the blocks can be used on their sides to do large areas. Now, you can go to the Derwent web page and they will show you all about grinding them up and making washes, sharpening them, using them for wet washes, using them on fabric. Today I'm just going to look at paper, but if you're going to use them on fabric, you can use them, particularly the blocks. I wouldn't really use the pencils on fabric, you'll just go through them too quickly. But the blocks you can use on fabric, activate them with water, make sure you really soak into them, and then you need to heat set them before you wash them, and then they become permanent on fabric as well, which is one of the things I completely love about this product. You can use it on fabric and on paper. And I haven't actually done something on fabric with the, actually no I have, I've done a book cover with them in fabric, but because it was part of a number of other layers you couldn't really tell they were Inktense blocks. Right, so today I'm using a watercolor pad. Now whenever you're going to use Inktense blocks or something that's very water activated, I recommend watercolor paper or mixed media paper, but particularly watercolor paper. The reason for that is it has sizing on it, which is a special water resistant layer. This particular paper has it added at the pressing stage. The really good quality Canson and Arches watercolor papers have it in the pulp stage as well, and often the pulp and the pressing stage, so you get two layers of it. That's why those papers are so darn good. And that allows you to have it not sink into the paper immediately, and you can work your pigments and blend them and do amazing things with them on the page. Now, I'm just having morning Coke. No, afternoon Coke. It's afternoon. Right. So, you can do a few different things with this. So, I'm going to pull these out over here so you can just see them there. Right, and you can do large areas with them. So if I pull out a block, you can do this, and you see how the grade of the watercolor paper is picking up that pigment. You can then decide that you want to layer another color with it. So let's just say I want to put a red in, and you can either do it across the grain, or you can decide that you're going to do something pretty awesome with it and blend it in. And then I'm going to go like really dark right next to it and see how that blends out. So I'm going to use a flat angled watercolor brush today. That's a wet brush, and now I'm going to activate that with water. Now the paper is caught, the blocks are caught in the grains, so I'm using a very wet wash and dipping my brush back in to try and move them out of the grains, although I really like the texture that I get with having, this is a medium grain watercolor paper. Now you can blend these while they're wet, but the moment that they're dry they won't move. So I'm just adding more water in now, and I'm going to let that bleed. Really wet. I'm going to let it bleed and see how I'm getting some pretty cool effects just letting it drip now. It's a great way to put beautiful watercolor backgrounds into any journal page that you're doing or painting. You can just do beautiful, great big washes in beautiful muted or bright colors, and then you can start layering on top, and you just get that ultimately beautiful depth of color that you're looking for. Now the thing with that is that if I was to now add something in wet, I can do that. So I can add something in wet. So say I want to add something in like in a navy wet. And you can see how it's immediately activating because the paper's wet. So you can add them in wet and dry. And I often add them in wet. And then I get a paintbrush and just blend them on the page when they're wet and get a completely different color. See, it's making a green. So the colors are blendable depending on your pigments, but if you notice it's pushing that red away. If I was to really work it into the page, that would start to make a neutral tone. So you can blend them when they're wet as well. And I often use them when they're wet as well if I'm just wanting to add a further depth of colour. So say I wanted to add a further depth of colour into this deep dark streak in the middle, I can just continue to work in when it's wet. And those lines will start to bleed and I'll start to get some interesting effects. So I'll just zoom in and you can see that I've done the straight line, but that now is just starting to bleed a bit. But I've still got the straight lines there and they're wet. I couldn't have achieved that look if I put them on dry. So you can go wet on wet, and that's one of the things I love about Inktense. If I wanted to add extra colour into this now, I can do wet on wet, and it just mixes right there on the paper. And I start getting this awesome green depending on how much yellow I choose to drop in. And you have a look at that. That pigment's coming off. So what I do, I just wipe it off. You can water activate it off before I put it back in the pan. So mixing, mixing, mixing. That's darker because it's near the red. And now we've gone green. These are fabulous for just being able to add depth after depth after depth. And then you can add more on them. When these are dry, you can add more on them again and again and again. The thing I love about the pencils though is they allow you to have fine work. Now, one thing to remember is these are not artists' waxy crayon pencils. So unlike your Prismacolor pencil, let me just pull one out. Unlike your Prismacolor pencil, which is soft, creamy, waxy core, these are brittle and hard, prone to breaking, and often they often have a chalk. But you can do something that's with these. If you don't have the blocks and you just have the pencils, you can apply water straight off the pencil. So you can get your water activated pen there, and you can just do a wash there straight off the pencil. Whereas I could do the same thing by going to a block. So I can just swipe that block and do the same thing. And then I can move that on the page. I can make that darker, lighter. I can then, when I've applied it, drag it down, make it as light as I possibly can if that's what I want to do. One thing about these two is they catch in moulding paste really quite well. And you can use them over the top of gesso, but if you use them over the top of gesso, you are going to pay the price because they will absorb into the gesso, and then they will mix with those chalky pigments and those plaster pigments, and they will go white. You know, like they will go much lighter because it's essentially like mixing them with white paint. You can mix these with paint as well. I've used Inktense blocks to tint moulding paste. I've used Inktense blocks by scraping off a little bit. So let me get you a little bit of moulding paste now. Okay, so I've got a little bit of moulding paste here, and I'm just going to use a tiny amount. I don't need to use a big amount. So there, that's a light modelling paste. It's Liquitex light modelling paste. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just get my craft knife and very gently just scrape a bit off. And you see, now let me bring it in. You can just start to see those fine filaments and scrapings going into that moulding paste, right? Just a little bit. Really, really fine scrapings. And by the way, if you want to make these into a point, you can. I would recommend doing it with something like a craft knife. Don't try and put them into a sharpener or anything like that. Now I can immediately start working these pigments into the moulding paste and have a look at the vibrant colour that you get just from a few scrapings from an Inktense block. Now that is an amazing thing that you can do, and that also dries permanent so that that becomes impermeable and suspended in. So here's that moulding paste now. How gorgeous is that? This is a way to just gently tint without adding any extra moisture to your texture paste. So think about it this way. I often used to tint my texture pastes with inks, re-inkers, paint, acrylic ink, artist ink, sometimes markers. But with Inktense blocks, you can leave them as thick and as dry as you like, so you're not changing the consistency to a more watery consistency by adding a liquid to it. And all you're doing is tinting it with a block. Now you can do the same thing when you sharpen your pencils. You can do the same thing then. So you may have to sharpen a pencil And by the way, these pencils need to be sharpened the same way that a proper pencil, artist pencil, needs to be sharpened. So let me get one that needs sharpening and I'll show you. I'll get my favourite colour out in the Inktense range. So I've got a pencil here. I'm using a Prismacolor one. They're a long, I've got the Derwent here. You sharpen them the same way that you sharpen artist pencils because they are more brittle even and delicate than the artist pencils, and they are prone to just flaking off. And what you do when you do this is you don't stress the wood to twist against its grain. Now I'm catching all of those in there, but if you take this lid off and do the same thing, then you can sprinkle them onto a page or keep them in little containers, and then you can bring those containers out and create washes with them the next time you want to use them. The thing I love about these is that, say I write a word, so I'm going to write a word here, and this is in a wax pencil, so it's not going to move. Right, now I've got that word in there, so I now want to outline that word. I'm just going to do it in a pale yellowy green so that you can see the contrast here. So I'm now going to bring that word in, and I'm just going to outline it gently on both sides, and see it's dragging a little bit of that wax pencil in. And then what I can do with that is I can water activate it. Now I recommend a very fine water. This is a Tim Holtz one. It's got a very fine nib. I'm going to get all of that blue out of it first. So now I've got the yellow, and I can give an illuminated colour and colour in between those letters with that pencil. Or if you're doing much larger work, and then bleed it out, which is particularly good when you're doing something along the lines of Joanne Sharp's style, and you can just bleed them out beautifully because they allow fine work and fine detail. If I was doing a larger letter, I'll just rip that off because it's quite wet now. If I was doing larger lettering and I wanted to use an India ink marker, just bear with me while I draw this in. Right, so I've got a larger word now. So what I want to do is actually colour that word in. Now you could do this with markers, or you could have a sketchy look with pencil or graded look. So I'm just going to go down that edge with the pencil. Very hard to do this with the block because you don't have the fine control. Now my ink is not completely dry, but for the purposes of this video you understand that. I would always let that dry, like really dry, even heat set dry. So I can get this in now, water activated it, and then drag the pigment out so that I have a graded word, and that's permanent. So it will go over just about anything except a wet. Remember, this is a water media, not a fat or oil based media. So if you wanted to use this, you would use it early on, and then your waxy oily products would go over the top. That allows you to give you some beautiful gradation in colour. Have a look at the gradation in the colour there. Awesome. And then you lay it down. Now you then have to think, okay, in what scenarios will I use this? They have such different properties because they're pure inks, so there's no wax in them, so that you can In the 72 set they really don't have flesh tones at all, so you couldn't use them as a base coat really for flesh unless you're putting your shadows in first, in which case they have umbers and ochres and things like that. Certainly lighter colours that you can use to do that, but they're not known for their ability to be able to do faces unless you're going to do different coloured faces that don't have actual flesh tones in them, and then they would look pretty awesome in my school of thought. These are really good for colouring in doodles. You can do that with colour pencils. They have the pencils are actually able to go into the finer details. So if you were to say draw a vine, so we're drawing a vine and I've just put some illumination over here, so I've put an illuminated letter and I'm doing all sorts of exciting viney things with it, which I used to do when I did illumination all the time. The properties I used to love doing there, I just find amazing. So I could go in and do and just have lots of swirls going in here and leaves and flowers. And this is nothing like what I would actually do if I was doing an illuminated panel, let me let you know. But you can then add pops of colour to everything that you do. I used to do tiny little flowers and leaves on my vines and fruit. So I'll do a little apple here. So let me get that in, and okay, so just a scratchy kind of doodle. But what you can do here, and you can use watercolor pencils for this, but if you're putting this as, say, an underlayer, or you want to make sure of its pigment holding properties, you can use these for this as well. So I can just go in, and I don't even need to colour this in. I can drag the colour across, just put one line in. Don't press really hard and squash the pigment of the paper when you're doing this then, because then you don't want it to catch when it goes. Your paper looks like that. Your paper looks like that. If you squash it, your paper's going to look like that, and all the pigment in here is going to really stick and it's going to be hard to move. So you want to just do these lightly. You don't need to press really hard. And we'll start. So you see the water's coming in, really activate it and then drag it over, and you look like you've used two different pencils. Get it in, drag it over, get it in, drag it over, all the way down, and because I did not press it into the paper, it's coming up beautifully. So this technique would be your underlayer. Now I've got that pencil there, I'm just going to do this to it and go back in and do that there, and add a few different greens in dots to just let them bleed in with those colours. And that one little dot from that pencil is going a long way, and you can see it's adding the blues in and just changing the colour of those leaves for every time I touch it, and that's gone quite far. The apple, let's get in, do the red, bring it across, join it with the yellow and just leave it. The M, and if I was doing this in illumination, this would be my bottom layer and would actually be able to do something on top of it. So leaving a little bit of the grade of the paper, letting your crayon impregnate the grade of the paper gives you natural light and shade in the flowers. So immediately you've got some, it's like a crappy looking doodle that's suddenly starting to look really good, but this is a permanent layer. This is not, you can work on top of this and add layers around it and with it, and you don't have to worry about the fact that it moves. The only way that this would ever move is if you didn't use an India ink pen with this, and then you'd have to worry about that bleeding. But otherwise, no, you would leave it like that. So that is my tutorial for Inktense blocks and pencils. The blocks should be stored in the tin. The pencils should be stored in the tin. If you leave them upright, even in a drawer, if you drop them, you will break the leads, and they have no wax in them, so you cannot microwave them. However, you can save your shavings and use them for watercolor effects, which is a really cool feature of them that you don't get in anything else but, say, watercolor pencils. But these are so intense, and that's why they call them Inktense, because they are so intense in their pigments that they work really well when you do even, you know, little things like that. So this allows you to really have some light and shade with your doodles and really practice doing landscapes and serious watercolor paintings. I can think of some amazing things that you can do with these, but a Technique Friday is all about just showing you the basic properties of them and then allowing you to go from there. So learn something new today. It keeps you young, and I'll see you next week.